Welcome back to Bloodline Mysteries. Our story today is about the macabre history of the Tillinghasts. They buried their dead in the living room floor. An extraordinary journey through history, mystery, and unexpected twists. Subscribe now so you never miss a story, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. The story you are about to hear is not one of ordinary misfortune, but of a family whose grief and fear shaped a legend that lingers still. In the hills of Rhode Island, the Tillinghast estate once stood tall, its brick walls and shuttered windows guarding secrets that neighbors dared not name. Within those walls, the dead were not carried to consecrated ground, but laid instead beneath the very floor of the living room, sealed under the hearth where the family gathered. Illness spread, whispers grew, and soon the house became less a home than a tomb. For generations, locals spoke of strange lights, of scratching sounds, of pale figures glimpsed in the night. And when at last the house fell to ruin, its silence proved no less chilling than its history. This is the macabre tale of the Tillinghasts, whose story reminds us that sometimes the dead do not rest, and sometimes the living cannot let them go. On a lonely rise of land in rural Rhode Island, the Tillinghast estate sat in silence. Fenner Hill was no mountain, only a slope of earth overlooking the valleys, but to those who lived nearby it seemed taller than it was. Perhaps it was the house itself, a square block of brick and shadow, that made the land feel so commanding. The home had been built to last, and in that ambition it stood longer than most of its neighbors, its walls refusing to crumble even as seasons of wind and rain stripped the paint from the shutters and warped the wooden beams inside. The Tillinghasts had come to Rhode Island generations earlier, seeking land and a place to set down roots. They were not poor, nor were they the wealthiest of their peers, but theirs was the sort of family that cultivated an air of permanence. With their wide fields and solemn orchard trees, they seemed determined to remain long after others had packed wagons and moved elsewhere. The house was a symbol of that determination, its straight lines and narrow windows watching over the countryside like a sentinel. Yet, for all its strength, there was an unease that settled around the estate. Travelers passing on the dirt road below spoke of how the shutters never seemed open, no matter the season. By daylight, the place looked asleep, as though the family within preferred to keep their eyes shut against the Sunday. By night, a lantern might burn behind the curtains, but no music or laughter spilled into the dark. Even the dogs of neighboring farms grew restless when led too near the stone walls that framed the Tillinghast yard. They barked and strained, their hackles raised, as though they sensed something unseen. The land itself carried a weight. Fenner Hill had once been a burial ground for native tribes, or so the oldest stories said, and farmers muttered that bones had been turned up in the plowing of fields. Whether true or not, the earth there seemed reluctant to forget. Stones pushed upward with each spring thaw, and roots twisted in unnatural shapes as if clawing for air. Still, the family prospered in their way, raising crops, building marriages, and leaving their mark on town records. To outsiders, they were simply another old New England clan. But to those who lived close enough to hear the creak of the house settling at night, the Tillinghast name carried a darker weight. The estate did not seem entirely a place for the living. Some whispered it had always been intended as a house for the dead. Inside the Tillinghast home, the parlor was the first room any visitor entered. It was not warm or inviting, not in the way neighbors' parlors often were. There were no cheerful rugs, no clutter of children's toys, or the scent of bread rising in the hearth. Instead, there was stillness, a kind of measured silence that seemed to hush anyone who crossed the threshold. The silence came in part from the eyes on the walls. The portraits began with the patriarchs. Heavy oils in thick wooden frames, painted in dark tones, showed men with long jaws, piercing gazes, and lips pressed tight against the suggestion of a smile. Their coats were cut in the fashion of Old England, their wigs powdered white, their posture stiff and commanding. These were the men who had carved the family's land from the forest, who had ordered bricks hauled up Fenner Hill to build the house that would outlast them all. They did not invite affection. Their stares suggested judgment, as though every guest who stepped into the parlor was weighed and measured and perhaps found lacking. Beside them, in smaller frames, hung the women of the family. Their faces were pale, their eyes large, their dresses draped in folds of fabric that seemed too heavy for their narrow shoulders. Some were young brides, captured before time and childbirth could mark them. Others were older, matriarchs with lines around their mouths and shadows beneath their eyes, gazing downward with a look that seemed to mix sorrow and resignation. Each one had been brought into the family, joined to the name Tillinghast, and each one had vanished into the silence of the house. Between the stern fathers and the solemn mothers were the children. Sons dressed in stiff collars, their hair combed neatly but their faces curiously blank, as though even in youth they had been taught not to laugh. Daughters posed in lace-trimmed gowns, their hands folded, their cheeks pale against the dim light of the parlor. None of them smiled. The painter's hand had captured them in detail, yet they seemed drained of warmth, frozen in a stillness that echoed the room around them. The portraits hung low on the walls, lower than custom, so that when one sat in the parlor, the faces loomed level with the eyes. No matter where a guest rested, the family was watching. Generations upon generations, staring outward from their frames, creating a congregation of the dead that presided over every gathering. The Tillinghasts did not need to speak. Their ancestors spoke for them, silently, from the walls. And in that silence, one could feel that the house itself had been built to remember them long after flesh and bone were gone. The winter of 1790 settled over Rhode Island with a bitterness that seemed to grip the land itself. Snow drifted in heavy banks against the stone walls of farms, and the ground froze hard as iron. To bury a body that winter was to fight the earth itself, chiseling into frost with shovels that broke more often than they cut. It was during that season that young Sarah Tillinghast fell ill. She had been a bright child, slender and pale, with eyes that glimmered even in the dim rooms of the old house. But the sickness that came to her was merciless. First it stole her strength, then her breath, and finally it left her lying still in her bed, while the fire crackled low in the hearth. Neighbors would later say she was only one of many, for the illness that swept through the countryside did not spare the young. Yet her death marked the beginning of something different, something whispered for generations after. When the moment came to lay her to rest, the family faced the earth, frozen solid outside their walls. Digging a grave in such conditions was near impossible. Yet there was another reason, darker and harder to speak aloud. Her father, Stukely Tillinghast, had grown convinced that the graveyard was not fit for his child. He feared that the dead buried in distant fields did not rest peacefully, that something in the soil claimed them too soon, stealing them away from the family forever. If Sarah was to remain theirs, she must be kept close, under the very roof where she had lived, and laughed and sickened and died. So the parlor floor was lifted, plank by plank, until the hard-packed dirt beneath was revealed. In the stillness of winter, while the wind scraped across Fenner Hill, the Tillinghast family gathered to watch as a narrow hollow was cut into the ground. Into this hollow they lowered the small coffin of Sarah Tillinghast. The boards were placed back above her, the seams pressed tight, and the parlor returned to its former quiet. But the silence was not the same. From that day forward, every step across the parlor seemed heavy. Visitors who sat in the chairs felt uneasy, as though they were intruding upon a presence just beneath them. And the family, though they did not speak of it aloud, could not help but glance at the floor whenever the firelight flickered. Sarah had not gone to the graveyard. She had not been surrendered to the world beyond the stone walls. She remained in the house, beneath their feet, as though the family could not, or would not, let her go. The years that followed Sarah's death brought no peace to Rhode Island. A sickness had taken root in the countryside, a wasting disease that crept through households like a shadow and did not let go. Consumption, they called it. It began with a cough, a simple sound at first, so ordinary that no one thought much of it. Then the cough deepened, hollow and ragged, stealing sleep at night. Soon came the fever, the weight that melted from the body, the skin that grew pale as candle wax. And when the disease reached its end, the breath left the lungs for good. Families were hollowed by it. Sons wasted away in their beds, daughters wilted like flowers starved of sun, mothers pressed damp cloths to their mouths, and fathers dug graves in frozen ground. Coffins multiplied until the town cemetery looked like a forest of wooden markers. Each week, the church bell tolled, sometimes twice in a single day, and the people of the valley came to dread the sound. The Tillinghasts were not spared. One by one, the children coughed at the hearth, their shoulders shaking beneath blankets, their lips stained faintly red. Visitors remembered the parlor, its low-hung portraits and its shuttered windows, and how the sound of coughing seemed to echo against the very walls. The family feared what was happening, but they feared the graveyard more. For Stukely Tillinghast, the father, the cemetery was a place of surrender, a place where the dead were lost to the earth and never seen again. He had buried his own kin there once, and believed he had felt their presence fade, slipping away into nothingness. To him, that was the greater horror, worse than death itself. So he clung to the decision he had made with Sarah to keep the family close even after breath had left them. As more children sickened, the parlor floor became a place of secrets. Each time another body stilled, the planks were lifted, the hollow widened, and another coffin slid beneath the house. The neighbors whispered when they saw no mourners on the road to the graveyard, no fresh mound of dirt among the others in the town plots. They whispered of what might be happening on Fenner Hill, though few dared speak too loudly. The pestilence raged, but the Tillinghasts resisted the march of coffins into the cemetery. While the rest of Rhode Island gave their dead to consecrated earth, the family gathered theirs into the silence of the parlor, sealing them beneath the very floor where the living still sat, still ate, still prayed. And in that mingling of the quick and the dead, the house itself grew heavier, as if the walls understood what was being done and would never forget. Stukely Tillinghast was not a man of quick temper or careless thought. To his neighbors he seemed steady, perhaps too steady, the kind of man who measured his words as carefully as he measured the furrows in his fields. Yet behind his stern face and deliberate manner he carried a private conviction, one that set him apart from every other household in Rhode Island. He believed the ground beyond his walls was cursed. The notion did not come to him all at once. It grew slowly, like a root working its way deeper into the soil. As a younger man he had buried relatives in the town cemetery, standing with hat in hand while the ministers spoke their solemn prayers. At first he accepted the rituals, believing as others did that the earth received the dead and that God would tend to their souls. But in the quiet months that followed each burial, he felt a distance settle over him. He could no longer sense the presence of those he had loved. It was as if the soil itself swallowed them whole, not only their bodies but their memory as well. When Sarah died, that fear sharpened into certainty. The frozen ground of the graveyard seemed to him more prison than resting place. To surrender his daughter to it was unthinkable. He told himself that the land on Fenner Hill was different, that within the walls of his own home the earth was not hostile. Here the hearth burned bright, and the fire was fed daily by his own hand. Here the family gathered, their voices filling the air, their footsteps keeping the rooms alive. If the dead must lie somewhere, better they lie where the warmth of the living could reach them. It was not madness to him, but reason. The hearth was a guardian, its smoke rising upward like prayer, its heat keeping away the chill that clung to graveyards. He believed the fire could shield the souls of his children, holding them close instead of letting them drift into the void. Others saw a house as nothing more than wood and stone. Stukely saw it as a vessel, a place strong enough to bind the living and the dead together. His wife did not argue, though sorrow had hollowed her eyes. The neighbors might shake their heads, but they did not speak to him of it. And so Stukely's theory hardened into practice. Each burial beneath the parlor floor was, to him, not desecration but devotion. To keep the dead near was not to curse them, but to protect them, to let the family fire guard their rest in a way no distant earth ever could. The Tillinghast home had always been quiet, a stillness that seemed to linger in its rooms even during the liveliest hours of the day. But in the months after Sarah's burial, that quietness took on another tone, a weight that unsettled those who entered. Visitors claimed that the silence was never complete, that if one listened closely, something stirred just beneath it. It began with faint reports. Murmurs passed along in hushed voices at the tavern or across fence posts between farms. Neighbors said that on certain nights, when the wind swept down Fenner Hill and rattled the shutters, other sounds could be heard from within the Tillinghast parlor. Not voices, not music, but dull, heavy thuds, like fists striking against wood from beneath the floor. Others spoke of scratching, soft at first, as though a small animal had found its way under the planks, but continuing far too long to be the work of a rat. The sounds seemed to begin after the lamps were extinguished, when the family should have been sleeping. Some dismissed it, claiming the old house was settling, its beams shifting against the cold. But others knew the sound of wood groaning, and they insisted this was different. One neighbor, passing late by the estate, swore he heard the noises even from the road. He quickened his pace, unwilling to look back at the shuttered windows that seemed to follow him in the dark. Inside the house, the Tillinghasts themselves did not speak of it openly. Yet those who visited noticed how the family avoided the parlor at night, how they kept to their rooms and lit more candles than seemed necessary. The children who remained grew pale and restless, their eyes darting to the floor whenever a sound carried through the boards. It was said that one of the daughters refused to step foot in the parlor after sundown, claiming she had heard her sister's voice there, calling faintly as if from a great distance. The whispers spread. If the living room of the Tillinghast estate had become a tomb, then perhaps it was not a silent one. Perhaps those buried beneath the floor were not content to remain where they had been placed. The thuds and scratches were taken as signs of unrest, as if the dead were trying to remind the living of their presence. By the spring, the story of the noises had become a tale told in low tones, a warning to children and a subject of unease for grown men alike. The house on Fenner Hill was no longer spoken of simply as strange or sorrowful. It was said to be alive with sounds that should not have been heard, whispers that rose from beneath the floor and turned the parlor into a place no light could comfort. It was not long after the first strange noises were whispered about that the children of the Tillinghast household began to speak of something far more unsettling. They claimed that Sarah, the sister buried beneath the parlor floor, had not remained still in her resting place. She had returned, not in memory or in dream, but in form. The younger ones were the first to confess it, their voices trembling as they clutched at their mother's skirts. They said Sarah came to them at night, long after the lamps had been put out and the house was meant to be quiet. She appeared in the doorway, pale against the darkness, her hands folded gently as though she meant no harm. Sometimes she would stand beside their beds, gazing down with eyes that glimmered in the faint glow of moonlight slipping through the shutters. And always she wore the same soft smile, a smile that carried neither warmth nor sorrow, only a strange and unsettling calm. At first, Stukely forbade them from speaking of it. He told them it was nonsense, nothing but the dreams of frightened children. Yet he could not explain the way the children grew restless, refusing to sleep, shivering whenever the wind creaked through the house. Nor could he deny the look in their eyes when they swore it was true. They were not telling stories. They were remembering. As the weeks passed, the visions grew more persistent. One daughter said Sarah had reached out to touch her cheek, the hand colder than winter air. A son claimed he woke to find Sarah sitting at the edge of his bed, silent, watching him until the dawn. Another swore that she had whispered his name, though no one else in the house had stirred. The mother, pale and worn from grief, said nothing. Perhaps she too saw something, though if she did, she carried it in silence. Only her gaze, weary and haunted, betrayed the weight she bore. Stukely, however, grew more rigid. He would not admit that his theory that the fire of the hearth would guard the dead was faltering. He clung to his belief, even as unease spread through his family like a second sickness. Among the neighbors, the story took on a darker shape. They said Sarah had risen because she was not content beneath the parlor floor. They said she walked again, a pale shadow tethered to the house that refused to let her rest. And within the walls of the Tillinghast estate, the children who had once loved their sister now feared the sound of footsteps in the night. for each creak of the floor might mean Sarah had returned once more, smiling softly in the dark. After Sarah's death, the house on Fenner Hill did not know peace. Whatever sickness had taken her did not leave with her burial, but seemed instead to linger within the walls. One after another, the Tillinghast children began to cough. It started lightly, a faint rasp in the chest, a hollow sound that echoed too loudly in the still rooms of the home. Soon it deepened, growing harsher, tearing through the nights, leaving the children pale and gasping by the hearth. The neighbors called it consumption, the wasting disease that hollowed out whole families across Rhode Island. But to those who watched the Tillinghast children fade, it seemed like more than illness. It was as if the sickness had chosen them, one by one, until no bed in the house was free of its shadow. When each child slipped away, the ritual repeated itself. The parlor floor was lifted, the earth beneath disturbed once more, and the hollow widened to make room. Sarah's coffin no longer lay alone. Another small box was placed beside hers, and then another still. Soon the hollow beneath the parlor became a hidden chamber of sorrow, a place where the children of Stukely and his wife rested side by side, stacked like kindling beneath the family hearth. Above them, life carried on in strained silence. The family still gathered at the table, still warmed themselves at the fire, still tried to pray for relief. But the weight beneath the floor grew heavier with each burial. Visitors noticed how the air in the parlor felt different, thick and close, as though every breath drawn there carried the chill of the grave. Even the fire seemed to burn lower, its flames reluctant to rise. The children who remained alive grew restless and afraid. They whispered that they felt their brothers and sisters near them, not only in memory but in presence. Some claimed they heard their names spoken softly from below the floor. Others swore they felt the faintest touch at their feet as they sat by the fire. Sleep became difficult, for every creak in the house sounded like movement from beneath. The neighbors, too, began to talk. They knew that coffins were not being carried to the cemetery. They knew the church bells rang less often than the sickness demanded. They began to look toward the Tillinghast estate with unease, whispering that the family was keeping their dead too close, and that such closeness could never end well. And so the curse, whether of disease or of something darker, spread through the house like a fire without flame. Each child lost deepened the hollow beneath the floor, and each burial bound the family tighter to the silence of the dead. The living and the departed were no longer separate in the Tillinghast home. They had become one, sharing the same roof, the same air, and perhaps even the same fate. The Tillinghast home had always seemed apart from the rest of the valley, its brick walls and shuttered windows standing watch on Fenner Hill like a sentinel. But as the years of sickness and strange burials passed, the distance between the family and their neighbors grew into something more than land. It became suspicion, a quiet fear that clung to every mention of the Tillinghast name. Farmers who drove their carts down the road at dusk told unsettling stories. They said that even when the shutters of the house were latched tight, a faint glow could be seen within. Candlelight flickered through cracks that should have shown only darkness, moving as though someone walked from room to room long after the family was meant to be asleep. Some swore they saw more figures in the glow than there were living Tillinghasts left, shadows bending and passing across the walls in ways that made the onlookers spur their horses faster. It was not only the light that troubled them. On still nights, when the air carried sound farther than it should, neighbors claimed they heard faint noises from the parlor. Not only the thuds and scratches already whispered about, but low murmurs, like voices in prayer or in argument. Some described it as chanting, others as weeping, though no one could agree. What they did agree on was that such sounds had no place in the silence of midnight. Rumors spread quickly in the taverns and churchyards. The Tillinghasts had buried their dead beneath their own floorboards. Everyone knew it, though few dared to speak the truth openly. And if they had done that, what else had they welcomed into their parlor? Some said they had called upon spirits to protect them. Others whispered that they had made a bargain with the devil himself, sealing it not in words but in the keeping of their dead so close. Superstition turned the family's grief into something darker. A neighbor might glance up at Fenner Hill and shiver, imagining not only a house but a tomb, glowing faintly like a lantern lit for the damned. Children were warned not to wander near it. Farmers crossed themselves as they passed. Even ministers lowered their voices when the Tillinghasts were mentioned. The family had sought to keep their loved ones close, but in doing so they had driven the living away. Where once the house had been a place of farming and family, it now stood as a place of whispers. To the valley below, the Tillinghast home was no longer the dwelling of neighbors, but the dwelling of something unholy, something that had crossed the line between the world of the living and the domain of the dead. By the time several children had been buried beneath the parlor floor, the Tillinghast family could no longer conceal the truth from the community. Stukely, weighed down by grief and desperation, turned to the ministers of Rhode Island for help. He asked them to come to the house, to pray over the sick, to bless the rooms where shadows seemed to gather. He wanted holy words to push back the darkness that had taken root beneath his roof. But the ministers, one after another, refused. To bury one's dead in the home was no small matter. It was not just unusual, it was a breaking of order. The ground of the graveyard was consecrated. It was hallowed by prayers, guarded by the cross, and marked as belonging to God. The parlor floor of a farmhouse was not. It was a place for living, for eating, for warmth and fire. To place the dead beneath it was, in the eyes of the church, to mingle what should never be mingled. When word spread that Stukely had dug into his own foundation to hide coffins, the ministers declared that the family had removed itself from God's protection. Some said openly that the devil had been invited into the parlor the moment the first spade struck the earth. Others muttered that the family was cursed, punished for arrogance in thinking they could bend the rules of life and death. When Stukely begged for prayers, ministers shook their heads. One told him, coldly, that prayers could not sanctify what had been desecrated. Another advised him to exhume the bodies, to carry them into the churchyard, and to seek forgiveness for the sin of keeping them close. Stukely refused, or perhaps he could not bear to move them. His sorrow was too great, and his conviction too strong. The family, already isolated, became marked. Neighbors who once shared labor in the fields began to keep their distance. Invitations to gatherings ceased. When the family walked into church, heads turned, and pews shifted away. The name Tillinghast was no longer spoken with respect but with caution, as if even mentioning it too freely might carry the taint of their choice. In the silence left by the ministers, the family drew inward. Their house became their church, their parlor, their graveyard. Their prayers whispered only to each other. Without the blessing of the clergy, their rituals took on a strange weight, as though their voices echoed only within those brick walls. The refusal of the ministers was more than rejection. It was a verdict. The Tillinghasts had placed themselves outside the order of God and man, and from that point forward, they carried the burden of being not just mourners, but outcasts. By the winter of 1792, the matter of the Tillinghasts could no longer be ignored. Too many stories had spread through the valley, too many whispers carried from one farmhouse to the next. The neighbors had kept silent as long as they could, but now they gathered in the meeting hall to speak openly of the house on Fenner Hill. The room was lit by lanterns, their glow casting long shadows across the wooden walls. Farmers, merchants, and ministers sat together, their voices low at first, as though speaking the family's name too loudly might invite its troubles into their midst. One man rose to his feet and declared that the Tillinghasts had mocked God's order. The dead belonged in hallowed ground, not beneath the hearthstones of a home. To leave them there was to stain the valley with sin. He urged that the bodies be exhumed, carried to the churchyard, and given proper burial. But another voice quickly rose in protest. What if disturbing the graves beneath the floor released something worse? The children had been buried there for months, some for years. And still, people swore they saw flickering lights behind shuttered windows and shadows moving across the walls. To tear up the parlor and drag the coffins into the light might awaken whatever already stirred within that house. The ministers, when asked for guidance, offered only division. Some insisted the only salvation lay in consecration, in righting what had been done wrong. Others urged caution, saying that no prayer could cleanse such defilement, and that meddling further might draw the devil's hand more firmly into their midst. Voices grew louder. Some men pounded their fists against the benches, calling for immediate action. Others shook their heads, unwilling to take on the burden of entering the Tillinghast home. No one volunteered to be the one who would lift the floorboards, to touch the coffins, to bear the risk of what might lie beneath. At last, the debate turned to fear. They spoke not of saving the family, but of protecting themselves. If the curse was contained within the walls of that brick house, perhaps it was safer to leave it so. Better to shun the Tillinghasts, to mark them as untouchable, than to risk unleashing their corruption upon the whole town. When the meeting broke apart, no decision had been made. The townsfolk left the hall as uneasy as they had entered, each man glancing toward Fenner Hill as he made his way home. The house loomed there in the darkness, silent, sealed, and yet alive with rumors. The question of what to do with the Tillinghasts hung over the valley like a storm that refused to break. Stukely Tillinghast was not a man easily shaken. He had faced the loss of child after child, the turning away of neighbors, the scorn of ministers. He bore it all with the grim resolve of a patriarch determined to keep his family together, no matter the cost. But in the long hours of night, when the fire in the hearth sank to embers and the house lay silent, his resolve began to crumble. For in those hours, sleep brought him visions he could not escape. He confessed to his wife that the dreams began with whispers. At first, he would hear the faint crying of children, voices he knew too well. The laughter of Sarah, the cough of his youngest son, the gentle humming of the girls. He would rise in the dream and follow the sounds into the parlor. There the floorboards shuddered, as though something beneath them stirred. Then came the moment he dreaded. In the dream, the boards would lift, one by one, not by his hand but by unseen force. Out from the hollow would emerge the shapes of his children, but they were not as he remembered them. Their faces were pale as wax, their lips blue, their eyes sunk deep into shadow. They came silently, moving like drifting smoke, and they would pass through the house, seeking the beds of the children still alive. Stukely swore he saw them bend low, their mouths pressing against the throats of their siblings. He saw their lips move, not in words, but in a hunger that needed no sound. And he saw the living children toss in their sleep, their breath faltering, their color fading, as though some unseen thing was drawing the very life from them. He always woke with a start, gasping for air, clutching his chest as though his own breath had been stolen. His nightclothes were damp with sweat, his body trembling, and yet he knew, even in the safety of waking, that the dream would come again. No prayer, no candle, no whispered comfort could keep it away. In the daylight he tried to reason with himself. The visions were nothing more than the cruel tricks of grief. But when he looked upon the faces of his surviving children, pale and sickening one by one, the doubt returned. Was it only a dream, or had the dead truly risen to take back what death had not yet claimed? The neighbors whispered of curses, of bargains, of shadows moving where no shadows should. But Stukely whispered only to his wife, speaking of dreams filled with blood and breath, of mouths upon throats, of the terrible fear that what he saw in the night was no dream at all, but the truth of what was happening beneath their roof. The people of Exeter had grown weary of whispers. For years, stories of the Tillinghast house had spread like smoke, curling through taverns and farmyards until no one could escape their reach. Some said the family buried their dead under the floorboards. Others claimed those same dead walked again, haunting the living with pale faces and hollow eyes. At last, a group of villagers decided they would see the truth for themselves. It was on a stormy night that they gathered, lanterns flickering in the wind and rain lashing at their cloaks. They stood at the edge of the clearing, the Tillinghast house looming before them like a shadow carved from brick and timber. The shutters were closed tight, but the watchers swore they could see a faint glow seeping out, a restless light moving from room to room. They waited in silence, their eyes fixed on the parlor windows. For a time, nothing stirred but the storm itself. Then, as thunder cracked across the valley, one of the men cried out. Behind the shuttered window, a figure had appeared. It was the shape of a girl, her head bowed, her face pale against the dark. Her lips moved, though no sound could be heard above the storm. Another figure joined her, then another still. Soon the watchers counted more than the living family could provide. They saw children who had been buried, children whose coffins they themselves had helped lower into the earth, yet here they stood, drifting like pale wraiths behind the glass. One farmer, braver than the rest, stepped closer to the house. He swore he heard scratching, faint but insistent, coming not from the walls but from beneath the floor itself. And with each peal of thunder, the scratching grew louder, until it seemed as though the earth itself was clawing upward. When the shutters rattled and the lantern light within flared unnaturally bright, the villagers broke. Fear seized them as surely as the storm. They fled down the hill, stumbling through the mud, swearing never to return. None dared look back until they reached the safety of their own hearths, and even then, many refused to speak of what they had seen. In the days that followed, when neighbors asked what the midnight watch had found, the men gave only half answers. Their eyes grew dark, their mouths tight, and they shook their heads in silence. Whatever truth they had witnessed at the Tillinghast house, it was too terrible to give voice. From that night onward, the people of Exeter kept their distance, letting the house on Fenner Hill keep its secrets. In the spring of 1793, a physician newly come to Rhode Island heard the whispers about the Tillinghast home. He was young, ambitious, eager to build his name in a valley where older men already held trust. To him, the rumors of hauntings and curses were nothing but superstition, the tired tales of frightened farmers. He declared that the sickness was no more than consumption, and that he would prove it with his own eyes. One gray afternoon, he walked up Fenner Hill with his satchel in hand. The villagers watched from a distance, unwilling to follow him to the door. Stukely Tillinghast received him with weary eyes, for the family had grown used to ministers and neighbors refusing them. Yet when the doctor asked to see the parlor and what lay beneath, Stukely agreed. Perhaps at last, someone would bring reason to their suffering. The physician stepped into the parlor, noting the heavy air, the way the fire seemed to burn lower than in other houses, the smell of damp earth that clung despite the hearth's warmth. At Stukely's signal, the boards were lifted, and the hidden hollow revealed. There lay the coffins, side by side, the children of the house resting where no children should. The doctor leaned close to examine them. What he found gave him pause. Though months had passed since some of the burials, the bodies showed little sign of decay. Their faces were pale but intact, their lips still tinged with faint color, as though they had only just fallen asleep. In one coffin, he swore the chest seemed to hold a trace of fullness, as though the body had not collapsed inward as the dead should. In another, he thought he saw a smear of red at the corner of the mouth. He brushed it away, but his hand trembled. He forced himself to continue, telling Stukely that such preservation could be explained, that the cold ground beneath the house slowed decay. Yet in his heart, doubt began to gnaw. When he pressed his ear close, he imagined he heard a faint sound, a sigh perhaps, or a whisper of air that could not be. He drew back quickly, his face pale, but said nothing of it aloud. When he left the house, he told the waiting villagers that the bodies were strange but not unnatural. He spoke of disease, of explanations rooted in medicine, but his words lacked conviction. His voice carried hesitation, and his eyes refused to meet theirs. That night, he wrote in his private journal that the Tillinghast dead did not look as dead should. He confessed to a terrible suspicion, one he dared not speak openly, that the sickness in the family was not only of the lungs and blood, but of something older, something that could not be named by medicine. By the mid-1790s, the Tillinghast family was a shadow of what it had once been, the bustling household that had filled the fields with laughter, work, and song was reduced to a handful of figures who moved like ghosts through their own rooms. They were thin, hollow-eyed and pale, their faces worn by grief, their bodies weakened by the same wasting illness that had already claimed so many of their kin. The neighbors rarely saw them outside anymore. Once, Stukely's sons had driven wagons into town, his daughters had traded at the markets, and the family's presence had been as steady as the brick walls of their house. But now, weeks would pass with no sign of them. When one of the Tillinghasts did appear, they spoke little, their voices hoarse and distant, as if speech itself had become a burden too heavy to carry. Inside the house, silence had settled like a second skin. Meals were taken without conversation. The parlor fire crackled, but no one told stories, no one sang hymns, no one spoke of hope for the spring. The children who remained alive lay in their beds most days, staring at the walls, listening perhaps to things no one else could hear. Even Stukely, once a man of fierce conviction, now moved quietly, his steps heavy, his words scarce. Some believed the family's silence came from fear, others thought it was the result of grief too deep for words. But those who watched from beyond the fields whispered another explanation. They said the Tillinghasts no longer trusted the living more than the dead. Having buried so many children beneath their own floor, the survivors seemed drawn downward, as though their ties to the departed were stronger than those to the neighbors around them. Visitors who braved the house spoke of strange habits. A daughter was seen sitting at the hearth, murmuring softly to no one visible. A son was found in the parlor, his chair drawn close to the floorboards, his ear pressed against the wood as if listening. Even the mother, weary and gray, was spotted setting extra places at the table, then quietly clearing them away before the meal began. These were not acts of madness, the neighbors said, but signs of a family who believed their dead still lived among them. At night, the silence of the survivors deepened into something uncanny. A lantern burned low in the parlor, casting shadows across the walls. If one passed close enough, one might hear faint movements inside chairs scraped as if being pulled, floorboards creaked as if with footsteps, sighs whispered as if many mouths breathed together. Yet, when morning came, the family denied nothing and explained nothing. They simply stared with hollow eyes, their lips pressed tight. The silence itself became more frightening than words. It was not the silence of peace or resignation, but the silence of people who had seen too much, who had lost too much, and who had chosen no longer to share their truths with the outside world. In their muteness, the Tillinghasts seemed to drift farther from their neighbors, farther from the church, farther even from the world of the living. By then, the valley had stopped thinking of them as a family at all. They were a house of survivors, yes, but survivors bound more to the dead than to each other. And as their silence grew heavier, it seemed to smother the very air around Fenner Hill, until no bird lingered in its trees, no farmer lingered in its fields, and no passerby lingered long enough to listen for what might stir beneath the floor. By the end of the long decade of grief, the burden of sorrow pressed hardest upon Stukely Tillinghast. The patriarch who had once ruled his farm and family with steady hands and firm commands was no longer the man his neighbors remembered. His shoulders, once straight as timber, sagged beneath the invisible weight of loss. His voice, once carried with confidence across the fields, had withered into a whisper, heard only within the confines of his own parlor. He took to pacing at night, when the others lay restless in their beds. The family grew accustomed to the sound of his boots dragging across the floorboards, slow at first, then quickening as though some urgent matter pressed upon him. Sometimes he muttered under his breath, words too faint to catch. Other times his voice rose loud enough to carry, though it was not directed to the living. Stukely spoke to the floor. He would stop in the center of the parlor, plant his feet, and bow his head as though listening. Then, in a tone both tender and desperate, he answered voices no one else could hear. He called out the names of the children buried below, his tone shifting as if in conversation, gentle when speaking to Sarah, stern when addressing his sons, and once even laughing softly before his laughter broke into a sob. To the rest of the family, listening from the shadows of the doorway, it was as if the patriarch had become a man split in two. One part above the floor with the living, the other below with the dead. Neighbors who heard of his midnight wanderings shook their heads and whispered that the devil had claimed him. They said he had made himself the keeper of two households, one of flesh and one of shadow, and the strain had shattered his mind. Yet those who lived under his roof saw something worse than madness. They saw a man who had surrendered to grief so deeply that he no longer belonged fully to the world of the living. In the daylight, Stukely barely spoke. He sat in his chair by the hearth, eyes fixed on the flames, lips moving soundlessly. He no longer tended his land, no longer gave instruction to his sons, no longer prayed at table. But when night returned, so too did his restless energy. He rose, paced, and resumed his conversations through the floorboards. The family heard him plead. They heard him argue. They heard him promise things that made their blood run cold. Once, his wife crept near to hear him clearly, and what she caught froze her where she stood. He was asking forgiveness from Sarah, from the others buried below. He was asking them not to take the ones who remained. He begged them to be merciful, to let his living children breathe a little longer. And then, in a broken whisper, he promised that he would join them soon. The collapse of Stukely was not a single moment but a long unraveling. Each night stripped another piece of him away until, in the eyes of those around him, he was no longer father, husband, or master of the house. He was a man walking a thin line between the silence above and the silence below, belonging wholly to neither. And in that liminal place, pacing the parlor as the shutters rattled in the wind, he became the very image of the curse that haunted Fenner Hill. When the end came for Stukely Tillinghast, it was neither sudden nor quiet. For months he had wasted away, a figure consumed by grief and shadows, his nights filled with murmured conversations to the children beneath the floor. The neighbors said he had been marked long before his final breath, that the sickness and sorrow that had consumed his family had finally reached its rightful master. The family, however, said little. They merely watched as the man who had once commanded the farm and the household drifted toward death like a candle burning to its wick. The day he died, the house stood utterly still. No work was done in the fields. No cart left the property. No voice carried into the air. The surviving family members gathered in the parlor, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes hollow from years of mourning. They did not weep loudly as others might have done. Their tears had long since run dry. Instead, they moved with grim certainty, as though they had always known this moment would arrive and had already chosen how it would unfold. They did not take Stukely's body down the hill to the cemetery, nor did they summon a minister to say the words of committal. They followed the pattern he himself had set. The floorboards were pried up once more, and the hollow beneath revealed. By now, the chamber had grown crowded. Coffins lay pressed together, wood against wood, the remains of children and kin resting in a strange intimacy. Into that hollow they lowered Stukely. No grand coffin marked his rest, no hymn accompanied his descent. The family whispered his name, their voices barely audible over the creaking of the boards, and then they placed him among the others, father joining children, patriarch, descending into the crypt he had built with his own hands and his own will. The parlor floor closed over him, and once again the house gave no outward sign of what lay beneath. But the truth could not be hidden. To those who knew, the house was no longer a dwelling but a tomb disguised as a home. The very hearth where meals were taken sat above the dead. The fire that once symbolized life and warmth now burned above a pit of silence. Every footstep across the parlor was a walk upon the coffins of kin. Every whispered word in that room was offered not only to the living but also to the dead who rested directly below. Neighbors, hearing of Stukely's burial, grew more fearful still. To bury children was tragedy. To bury the patriarch beneath the same floor was to seal the family's fate entirely. They said the Tillinghast house was no longer touched by grace. It had become something other, a structure where the veil between the two worlds was thinnest, where the living and the dead mingled beneath one roof. With Stukely's final burial, the family ceased to resemble the community that surrounded them. They were no longer merely mourners, nor even survivors. They were keepers of a house of graves, guardians of a crypt that masqueraded as a farmhouse. And from that day forward, Fenner Hill bore not only the weight of sorrow but the presence of death itself, lodged firmly within its brick walls and wooden floors. After Stukely's death, the Tillinghast estate lingered like a wound that would not heal. The few children who remained could not endure the weight of the place any longer. They had grown thin, hollow-eyed, their voices reduced to whispers, their steps cautious, as if afraid to wake something beneath the floorboards. In time, even silence became unbearable. They left without ceremony, slipping away from the house that had been their cradle and their prison, abandoning it to the dead who claimed more space in its walls than the living ever had. What remained was a structure still warm with memory, as though the family had stepped out only for a moment and might return before dusk. Neighbors who dared to push open its door said the air carried a stillness so heavy it pressed against the chest. Dust had begun to settle, yet chairs were drawn close to the parlor hearth, their backs bent slightly toward one another, as if frozen in the middle of some eternal vigil. Plates remained on a side table, faint traces of bread hardened to stone. Curtains, though tattered, hung neatly in their places. It was not the ruin of a home emptied by disaster, but the eerie calm of one where life had been gently laid aside and forgotten. But beneath that surface order lay unease. Each creak of the floor was sharper than it should have been. Each groan of the timbers echoed too deeply. Farmers who entered swore the parlor floor felt different from any other, as though the planks carried a weight greater than wood could bear. Some claimed they could sense the hollow beneath, the strange chamber where the family had buried their own. It was not a cemetery marked by crosses, nor consecrated by prayer, but an unseen vault in the heart of a farmhouse. To stand upon it was to know one's feet were placed on coffins. The locals avoided it more and more. They crossed the road rather than pass too near. Travelers were warned against spending the night in its rooms, lest they hear the faint sounds that sometimes stirred after dark scratches, taps, or the muffled thud of something shifting beneath the floorboards. Some dismissed these stories as superstition, the product of gossip carried too far. But even those who scoffed could not explain why the house never seemed to decay as quickly as others. It stood stubborn against storms and winters, its timbers refusing to surrender to time, as though the dead within were holding it upright. Children whispered that candlelight could sometimes be seen flickering through its shuttered windows, though no fire burned on the hearth. Men who had grown bold enough to step inside said the parlor smelled faintly of earth, damp and cold, even when the day outside was warm. They left quickly, crossing themselves, muttering that no dwelling should hold both the living and the dead under the same roof. In the end, the house remained as it had always been, waiting. Chairs around the hearth stood ready for bodies that would never return. The table held its place for a meal that would never be eaten. And beneath it all lay the family, side by side, a congregation of the silent, keeping their watch beneath the boards. The Tillinghast estate had become more than a ruin. It was a threshold, a place neither alive nor dead, left to stand empty while the earth remembered. It was many generations after the last of the Tillinghasts had abandoned their home when the estate drew breath again. By then the house had passed through silence, neglect, and the patient gnawing of time. Shingles had curled on the roof, ivy crept across the brick walls, and the parlor shutters hung loose like eyelids that no longer cared to open. Yet still it stood, and in the late 19th century a new family, unaware of its history, purchased the land and decided to restore the old place. The work began as it always does, with hammers and saws, with men hauling away the evidence of years. Dust filled the air, and laughter echoed in the empty hallways as laborers stripped down paneling and pried loose, rotten boards. The house seemed ready to yield, to shrug off its past and dress itself in fresh timber. Yet when they reached the parlor, where the floor sagged in the center like a weary back, something resisted. The boards were warped, their edges dark with damp, and the workers set themselves to tearing them out. One after another came up, nails screeching, splinters flying, until they struck upon the hollow space beneath. A smell rose then, faint but unsettling earth that had been long sealed, dry and stale, as if it had not breathed air in a century. The men expected to find rot, perhaps a collapsed foundation. What they uncovered instead froze them in their places. Beneath the floorboards lay not coffins, not the neat boxes of the dead, but bones. Bones stacked in order, as if someone had taken care to arrange them not in rest, but in storage. Long femurs laid side by side, ribs bundled like kindling, skulls placed in a row with their faces turned upward, blank eye sockets staring through the gap into the light of the parlor once more. There was no soil to cover them, no shroud to soften the sight, only naked bone, yellowed with age but disturbingly clean, as though time itself had hesitated to finish its work. The men stumbled back, their tools clattering against the boards. Some muttered prayers, others spat to ward off evil. For a moment no one spoke, but the silence between them was heavy with recognition. They had not merely uncovered a burial. They had intruded upon something deliberate, something chosen. These were not the remains of strangers lost and forgotten. They were a family, stacked together beneath the heart of their home, hidden not in haste but in grim intention. News spread quickly through the countryside. Villagers who had whispered old tales now found their suspicions hardened into truth. The stories of candlelight, of scratching sounds, of bodies buried in the parlor floor, they had not been invention, but memory carried through generations. Ministers shook their heads, townsfolk crossed themselves, and the Tillinghast name once more was spoken with unease. Some said the bones should be reburied properly, carried to holy ground and laid beneath the blessing of the church. Others argued they should remain where they were found, for to disturb them now was to invite the very curse that had haunted the family. In the end, the bones were handled with care, though none agreed on whether reverence or fear guided the workers' hands. Yet long after the boards were sealed again and the parlor restored, the house did not lose its chill. Visitors swore the air there never quite warmed, even when a fire roared in the hearth. They said the memory of bones remained, an invisible weight pressing down from beneath. For the dead, once uncovered, are never easily forgotten. The rediscovery had not freed the Tillinghasts from their legend. It had only deepened it, binding their house forever to the truth of what lay beneath its floor. Today, the Tillinghast estate stands not as a home, but as a husk. The roof has given way in places, the shutters hang crooked, and the garden has long since surrendered to wild growth. Yet despite its ruin, the house remains intact enough to remind all who pass of its grim history. Travelers who wander too close speak of a weight in the air, as though the place itself is watching. Those who are brave enough or foolish enough to step inside report the same sensation, that the parlor, above all rooms, is thick with unseen presence. It is said that to enter that chamber is to feel pressed upon by countless eyes, as though the dead beneath have not forgotten their vigil. The air grows heavy there, staler than in any other corner of the house, carrying with it a faint trace of damp earth. Some visitors swear that when they place their feet upon the warped planks, the floor seems to give slightly, like a shallow breath drawn from below. There are tales of strange noises that have never ceased. In the dead of night, when the wind is still, the ruins sometimes echo with faint tapping, as though skeletal fingers brush against the boards. Others tell of muffled thuds, like something shifting restlessly in its confinement. Candles have been reported to gutter in still air, flames bending as though disturbed by breath. Even modern visitors, armed with lanterns and cameras, have left shaken, claiming their devices failed in the parlor, batteries drained as though swallowed by the house itself. Legends say that those who linger too long in the parlor may catch sight of pale shapes in the corner of their vision. Some describe a girl, her smile faint and sorrowful, standing by the hearth as if waiting for her family to gather. Others claim to see gaunt faces staring from the window, though when they step outside, nothing is there but shattered glass and ivy. The most chilling accounts come from those who insist they heard whispers rising through the floorboards, soft and layered, like many voices speaking at once, yet none clear enough to understand. The Tillinghast story has passed into folklore, woven into the darker fabric of Rhode Island's history. Scholars have debated whether the family's strange burials were born of superstition, madness, or grief too deep to bear. Ministers condemned it as sin, physicians dismissed it as ignorance, and yet neither faith nor science has erased the unease that clings to the estate. For in the end, no explanation can banish the dread of bones arranged in careful order, kept beneath the hearth of a family home. What remains is not only ruin, but memory. The house is no longer lived in, yet it refuses to rest. It holds its secrets tightly, as if the dead within have claimed it for themselves. Generations later, people still cross the road to avoid its shadow. Children dare each other to touch its door, though few linger long enough to try. The legend endures, whispered from mouth to mouth, that in the parlor of the Tillinghast estate, the dead have not departed. They wait, as they always have, pressing against the floorboards, watching with eyes that see through centuries. And so the tale closes, not with peace, but with the haunting that remains. The Tillinghasts are gone, their voices silent, yet their presence lingers, as steady as the house itself. Those who step into that parlor carry the memory with them long after they leave, for the sense of being watched does not fade easily. It clings to the skin, follows into dreams, and leaves one waking in the dark, wondering if the weight at the foot of the bed is only imagination, or if something pale and smiling has returned, as it once did, to stand in the quiet hours of the night.